13 years is a long time to wait for a part 2. But I guess it's less than half as long as it took for Maverick to return to the skies, and they didn't even have to invent anything. So let's take a look at what took James Cameron so long to return to Pandora and surprise space. It's the water stuff. Now we're gonna be getting a little technical with some motion capture, mumbo jumbo, AI stuff, etc, etc. But what took him so long? Keyword is technology. Now you can't make a movie without a camera, and for Avatar 2, your Samsung Galaxy ain't gonna cut it. So for Jimmy Cameron, yeah, he lets me call him Jimmy, he went with the first full-frame motion picture camera called the Sony Venice. The director had high praise for the camera's dynamic range, and that makes sense because when Sony was developing the camera, they were working closely with Cameron's Lightstorm company. Pretty pictures aren't the only thing that made this movie possible. You see, cameras are very bulky, even the one I'm filming on right now. When you start adding IMAX and 3D elements into it, the bulkiness just gets more and more restrictive. So how do we solve that? Well, the Venice can be adapted to what's called the Rialto sensors. We've seen what the Rialto sensors can do in a long-awaited sequel I mentioned before, Top Gun Maverick. By removing the sensor block from the main body of the camera rig itself becomes both lighter and smaller. This allowed cameras with IMAX-sized sensors to be stuffed into crammed cockpits of the US Navy F-18s.
Check this out.
This means that actors could be filmed in jet fighters, doing jet fighter things, pretending to be jet fighters, and presumably not flying, but then again, Tom Cruise, so who knows. For the way of water, it turned what is usually a cumbersome 3D rig into something that could be shoulder mounted, with Cameron himself hoisting the camera for specific shots. During filmmaking, water is notoriously uncooperative. For the first Avatar, James Cameron invented a new special 3D rig that brought to life one of the best 3D experiences in all of movie history. However, things were gonna have to change in the sequel due to the environmental shift of the narrative. Generally, underwater scenes are handled by subjects placed in the water and the camera is outside looking in. The tricky thing is here, you got light refraction through the water and some glass, and some more glass, then a mirror, a little bit more glass, and then a sensor. But what do we know now? Light is weird, so are cameras. So the lightweight CineAlta 3D packed on pounds, 180 of them, to go underwater with the camera crew, who went through the same kind of freediving training that the actors did so that the scuba bubbles wouldn't muck up the motion capture. While the weight is neutral underwater, it took a great deal of effort to change the direction due to its mass. To assist, Grips had to rig a series of control arms that help stabilize and move the camera through the water. Now, if you're a right-minded person like myself, you would probably think, well, motion capture underwater shouldn't add any bit of complexity, you just fix it in post, right? Well, that's the reason you're not James Cameron. Well, one of the reasons. There's a whole philosophical quandary. Cameron needed the motion capture to work underwater, which brought a number of challenges. Motion capture is done by using several cameras capturing key movement points marked on special suits that are then fed into a big old machine computer thing that redraws the motion capture performers as these tall 9-foot space creatures. And part of that was the good folks over at the animation studio Weta FX, who came up with smaller motion capture cameras that could be submerged. They also had to top the 900,000-gallon pool built specially to simulate ocean currents, as well as accommodate the motion capture rigs with white balls to eliminate overhead light pollution in the shot. Then further care had to be taken to make sure that the water didn't reflect the surface from the floating white balls. In metaphor, it's kind of like swallowing a spider to eat a fly that you swallowed before, like Jesus said. Light is a tricky issue. Part of that was solved for an earlier Weta production, Matt Reeves' Planet of the Apes movies. There, a facial performance capture was assisted by 2 cameras mounted on the actor to give a better indication of not only the muscle movement, but how the light played a role on their face. This was paired with an on-set mock-up of what meant to be the final image. Recordings of both the actor and the maquette, which is just a fancy term for the model they're trying to create, are merged to get the lighting as realistic as possible. And then there's the lighting issue of the Na'vi's skin being blue. To get a better idea of how color reflects light, the camera team was sent to the Hawaiian forest to capture the way the colorful foliage reflects light. Likewise, they were sent to capture the details and nuances of tidal behaviors, down to the sand and sediment moving in with the waves and being redeposited in ripples on the seafloor. We've come a long way since when computer artists needed to map each individual pixel on a screen. Even in 8-bit, that was a tedious process, and with the amount of imagery and color and detail in Avatar: The Way of Water, 13 years wouldn't be enough time to even do that. At any given moment, Weta was processing 8 gigabits of graphics per minute. If they were doing that once, it'd be daunting. But during a GQ interview that followed Cameron into the post-production process, he was looking at a clip labeled the 405th version of that shot, with 3,240 effect shots and 2,225 of them being underwater. That's going to take a whole lot of filling in, and that's when the AI take over. Now that Cameron and AI have kissed and made up after creating the Terminator franchise, they rendezvous again to create something spectacular. A system developed for Gemini Man was adapted that uses flow maps to create pores, shapes, and other different depths of skin. Then I learned a new word. See, the effects team studied conjunctiva. The conjunctiva is the mucousy membrane that covers your eyeball, but I guess I skipped that day of biology, but I'm kinda happy I did, because I don't know how I feel about that. Weta also used their Tortara organic tree growing tool to fill in Pandora's lush jungles and underwater plant life. Frame rates are a tricky thing. Even someone like me who does video stuff all day, I'm still not really sure how it works. But if you watch Empire of Light, or at least seen the trailer, you've heard Toby Jones wax poetic about the trick of the brain called the persistence of vision. Simply, if your eye sees 24 sequential still images in the span of a second, your eyes and brain will decide that they're actually watching something in motion and not, in fact, 24 still images separated by darkness that you actually never perceive. Spooky. But you don't have to stop at 24 frames per second. A lot of things on TV nowadays are 60 frames per second, and even films like The Hobbit and Gemini Man were filmed at higher frame rates as well. And if you're a gamer like myself, don't get me started. But this in the end becomes a double-edged sword. It is both more realistic and smoother action, but since we are so accustomed to 24 frames per second, it could be wildly distracting. So for non-action scenes, the movie runs 24 frames per second, but for the set pieces, 48. Since the projector can't change gears for the 24 FPS sequences, each frame was doubled. With all that focus on technology, one's probably wondering, well, what about all the story? Isn't that what makes a good movie? Well, that's why you're watching this. Here we go. Cameron approached the story with the same level of dedication and detail. Having mapped out the story of Pandora and the Na'vi into a 5-part series, he spent 18 months working with writers whiteboarding the entire saga from beginning to end, only assigning the writers the individual movies at the end of the process. Cameron figured if they knew which one they were going to be working on, they would tune out of the other stories. As the saying goes, there's fast, cheap, and good. And you can only pick 2. But that doesn't really apply for James Cameron. Not only did the sequel take years to happen, this was the most expensive movie ever made. Cameron even admitted that the business model for the film was absolutely ludicrous, having to enter the top 5 highest grossing films of all time just to break even. But then again, Fox almost turned down the first Avatar due to its price tag. Given the first success, they were willing to bet again and put $1 billion down for the entire series. That's a lot of money. Sci-fi icon and action auntie Sigourney Weaver has returned in a James Cameron flick once again, but this time as a clone. Well, kinda. Na'vi teenager. Given that everything is motion capture, it would have been easier to have the more intense parkour and underwater sequences performed by someone else. But Sigourney Weaver was committed to doing it, so she had to do the free diving training as well as the forest parkour bits with everyone else. But honestly, it's Sigourney Weaver. She could be 150 years old fighting aliens in a wheelchair, and I wouldn't be surprised. You know that you set the bar high when you have a $440 million opening weekend, and that's still considered a little disappointing. Regardless, it looks like The Way of Water is going to clear that success hurdle, and I'm looking forward to the upcoming sequels. Either way, my name is Noah Marks. Have a good one.